Imagine discovering a room that shouldn't exist. A room sealed for 33 years, hidden in the underground levels of a building that harbored one of the most disturbing mysteries in American history. A room that would finally explain how 27 people, 23 orphaned children and 4 adults, simply vanished from the face of the earth on a single November night in 1979. In March 2012, when the demolition machines arrived at the Old St. Mary's Home for Children in Whitefish, Montana, the workers expected to find only rubble and abandoned memories. Instead, they discovered something that would make federal investigators reopen a case that had been filed away for decades. If you are watching this video, please subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. What you are about to discover will challenge everything you think you know about mass disappearances and reveal a truth so disturbing that authorities deliberately kept it secret for years. This is the story of Emily Rodriguez and 26 other people who disappeared without leaving traces on a cold November night. For 33 years, there was speculation about cults, alien abduction, and government conspiracies. But the truth, when it finally emerged from a room buried under tons of concrete, was stranger and more terrible than any conspiracy theory could ever imagine. This is a story about secrets that were literally buried, about a discovery that changed everything, and about 27 lives that became the center of one of the most bizarre cases the FBI ever investigated. Emily Rodriguez was 15 years old when she became part of Montana's most inexplicable mystery. With dark brown hair always tied in 2 braids, expressive brown eyes, and an average height of 1 meter 60 centimeters, Emily possessed that kind of quiet presence that made the smaller children in the orphanage feel safe. She had arrived at St. Mary's Home for Children in January 1977, at 13 years old, after her parents died in a car accident on Interstate 90. The orphanage, located in the mountains of Whitefish, Montana, was a Catholic institution that housed orphaned and abandoned children from throughout the American Northwest. Emily quickly became one of the most beloved residents of St. Mary's. She possessed a natural talent for caring for the smaller children, especially the babies who occasionally arrived at the orphanage. The nuns frequently found her humming Spanish lullabies to calm the little ones who cried during the night. Emily had this impressive maternal gift for such a young girl, remembered Sister Catherine Morrison, who worked at the neighboring orphanage and visited St. Mary's regularly. She was like an older sister to all those children, especially to the younger ones who arrived scared and confused. Emily's daily routine followed the rigid schedule of the Catholic orphanage. Wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning for morning prayers. Breakfast at 6:30. Classes in the internal school from 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Domestic chores until 5 o'clock in the evening. Dinner, supervised studies, and lights out at 9 o'clock at night. It was a structured, predictable life, but not necessarily unhappy. The St. Mary's Home for Children was an imposing 3-story construction, made of local gray stone that rose like a medieval castle against the Montana landscape. The building had been constructed in 1923 and housed up to 30 children, although in November 1979, only 23 orphans resided there with ages between 6 and 17 years old. Emily shared a room on the 2nd floor with 2 other girls. Madison Clark, 14 years old, a shy young woman with red hair who had lost her parents in a house fire, and Jessica Williams, 12 years old, abandoned at the orphanage door when she was a baby. The 3 had formed a substitute family, protecting each other from the rigors of institutional life. The teaching staff at St. Mary's consisted of 4 dedicated adults: Mother Superior Margaret O'Connor, 58 years old, a severe but fair woman who had directed the institution for 15 years, Sister Patricia Walsh, 34 years old, responsible for teaching the younger children, Sister Dorothy Evans, 41 years old, who took care of medical and nutritional aspects, and Mr. Thomas Mitchell, 52 years old, caretaker and the only male employee who also taught carpentry to the older boys. Emily stood out academically, especially in literature and history. She dreamed of becoming a teacher or social worker. She wanted to help other children who, like her, had lost their families. On weekends, she wrote in a brown leather diary that she had received from the Mother Superior on her 15th birthday, documenting not only her thoughts, but also small happenings from life at the orphanage. Emily's personality was marked by precocious wisdom and genuine compassion. She was frequently chosen to mediate conflicts among the smaller children, and the staff trusted her to help with new residents who arrived traumatized and scared. Emily had this unique capacity to make a child feel at home, remembered Father Michael Santos, who visited the orphanage weekly to celebrate Mass. She possessed an impressive emotional maturity, but never lost that adolescent sweetness that made her special. In the months leading up to November 1979, Emily had become particularly close to some of the newest residents, especially two small sisters, Amanda Davis, 6 years old, and Brittany Johnson, 8 years old, who had arrived at the orphanage in September after their parents were arrested for child neglect. Emily also maintained a respectful but warm relationship with the staff. She frequently helped Sister Patricia in classes, organized the clothing closets with Sister Dorothy, and learned basic carpentry skills with Mr. Mitchell, who treated her like the daughter he never had. At 15 years old, Emily Rodriguez was more than just an orphan. She was the emotional heart of St. Mary's Home for Children. She was the one who consoled the little ones during storms, who organized small birthday festivities with limited resources, who kept hope alive among children who had lost everything. On the night of November 13th, 1979, Emily wrote her last entry in the diary. Today was a special day. Amanda finally smiled during dinner, and Brittany called me Big Sister for the first time. Sometimes I think that maybe God has a plan for all of us here. Maybe our real family is the people we choose to love. The next morning, Emily Rodriguez, along with all the other 26 people from St. Mary's Home for Children, had completely disappeared. Without traces, without explanations, without goodbyes. And for 33 years, nobody knew what really happened that night, until a secret room revealed a secret that would change everything. Wednesday, November 14th, 1979. A date that would become synonymous with impossibility, marking the day when 27 people simply evaporated from reality as if they had never existed. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came from the silence. Dr. Robert Hayes, local Key Beach physician who visited St. Mary's every Wednesday at 9 o'clock in the morning for routine checkups of the children, arrived punctually at the orphanage to find a silence so profound it made his blood freeze. There was no laughter from children playing, no voices from the staff, not even the constant noise of small feet running through the wooden corridors. I knocked on the main door for 5 minutes, Dr. Hayes remembered in his statement to the police. The silence was unnatural. In 15 years visiting that place, I had never experienced such quietude. It was as if the building was completely empty. At 9:15, Dr. Hayes decided to use his emergency key. All professionals who worked regularly with the orphanage had one for urgent medical cases. He opened the heavy oak door and entered what should be a busy entrance hall, full of childish life. Instead, he found absolute emptiness. The first thing that struck him was the strangeness of the scene. There were no signs of struggle. There was no evidence of hasty departure. There were no indications of violence. The entrance hall was impeccably organized, as if it had been thoroughly cleaned the night before. The children's coats, hanging on hooks near the entrance, were all in place. The shoes were organized in perfect rows under the wooden bench. Dr. Hayes quickly went up to the second floor, where the children's dormitories were located. His heart was beating so hard that he could hear it echoing in the empty corridors. He opened the first door, the room of the older girls, where Emily Rodriguez slept. The beds were perfectly made, as if they had never been used. There were no scattered clothes. There were no toys left behind. There was no evidence that 3 teenagers had slept there the night before. Even stranger, the dresser drawers were empty, but organized, as if the clothes had been carefully removed instead of quickly packed. Room after room revealed the same impossible scene: perfect tidiness and total absence of their occupants. On the third floor, where the staff's rooms were located, Dr. Hayes found the same thing. Mother Superior Margaret's quarters were immaculately clean. Her desk was organized, her prayer books stacked with military precision, her bed made with hospital corners. But all her personal clothes, important documents, and personal items had disappeared. At 9:45, Dr. Hayes called the Flathead County Sheriff's Department in panic. "I need to report I don't even know what to call this," he told the operator. 27 people have disappeared from St. Mary's home. All of them. Children, staff, everyone. Sheriff David Miller arrived at the orphanage at 10:20, accompanied by 2 deputies and a growing sense of incredulity. In his 22 years enforcing the law in Montana, he had never faced anything remotely similar. The initial investigation of the site revealed anomalies that defied any logical explanation. In the kitchen, breakfast was partially prepared. Scrambled eggs still in the pan, bacon on a baking sheet in the turned-off but cold oven. 27 bowls were arranged on the communal dining table, each with a spoon beside it, as if meals were about to be served when something interrupted the process. Even more disturbing, there were no dirty dishes in the sink. This suggested that the previous night's dinner had been normally served, consumed, and cleaned, indicating that whatever had happened occurred between the post-dinner cleanup and breakfast preparation. In the Mother Superior's office, the daily record book was open to the page of November 13th. The last entry, written in the Mother Superior's perfect handwriting, said, "All children healthy and in good spirits." Sister Patricia reported excellent academic progress from the younger classes. Mr. Mitchell completed repairs on the third-floor roof. Clear weather, low temperature. Evening prayers at 8:30 proceeded normally. There was nothing in the entry that suggested problems, concerns, or any indication that something extraordinary was about to happen. In the orphanage library, investigators found something that left them even more perplexed. 23 books were open on different tables, each apparently being read by one of the children. Bookmarks made of colored paper indicated where each child had stopped reading. Some books were open in the middle of chapters, others on final pages, but all seemed to have been left in an orderly fashion, as if the children had carefully marked their pages before departing. But departing to where and why? At 11:30, Sheriff Miller made the decision to contact the FBI. A mass disappearance of 27 people, including 23 minors, was far beyond the jurisdiction and capacity of the local department. While awaiting the arrival of federal agents, local investigators continued documenting the bizarre scene. In T2, the younger boys' dormitory, They found something particularly touching. Small colored drawings scattered on a table, apparently art made during the previous afternoon's free time. One of the drawings, clearly made by a small child, showed 27 stick figures holding hands under a blue sky, with "Our St. Mary's Family" written in awkward letters at the top. It was as if the children knew something was about to happen. The outside temperature that day was at -5 degrees Celsius, with light snow falling since the early morning hours. There were no footprints in the snow around the orphanage, neither coming nor going. This was particularly disconcerting, as it meant that whatever had happened occurred before the snowfall began, approximately at 2 o'clock in the morning. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from the orphanage basement. There, investigators found something that didn't appear on any architectural blueprint of the building: evidence of a wall that seemed to have been recently sealed with fresh concrete. The wall was damp, as if the concrete had been applied in the last 24 hours. When they questioned local workers, no one had been contracted to do any type of construction work at the orphanage. Even stranger, there was no construction equipment on site, no empty cement bags, no evidence of how the concrete had gotten there. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on November 14, 1979, St. Mary's Home for Children was officially declared a federal crime scene. 27 people had disappeared without leaving a trace, and the only clue was a concrete wall that shouldn't exist. The mystery was just beginning. The arrival of the FBI at St. Mary's Home for Children transformed the local investigation into a massive federal operation. Within 48 hours, the abandoned orphanage was surrounded by special agents, forensic specialists, and investigation equipment that the small town of Whitefish had never seen. Special Agent Daniel Brown, an 18-year veteran of the Bureau and specialist in missing persons cases, took leadership of the investigation. He had worked on kidnapping cases, religious cult cases, and even supposed extraterrestrial abductions, but had never faced a simultaneous disappearance of 27 people without any physical evidence. "In all my years of experience," Agent Brown said in an interview years later, "I had never seen such a clean scene. It was as if someone had carefully erased all evidence that these people had ever existed." The first theory investigated was mass kidnapping by a criminal organization. In the late 70s, there were growing concerns about human trafficking and cults that targeted vulnerable children. An operation to kidnap 27 people simultaneously would require extensive planning, multiple vehicles, and a sophisticated organization. But this theory quickly crumbled. There was no evidence of vehicles large enough to transport 27 people in the area. The rural roads around the orphanage were limited and easily monitored. More importantly, local neighbors, including farmers who lived within observation distance of the orphanage, reported no unusual activity, strange noises, or vehicle traffic on the night of November 13th to 14th. The second theory was mass escape. Perhaps the children and staff had conspired to leave the orphanage together, possibly due to unreported abuse or unacceptable conditions. This theory gained initial strength when investigators discovered that the orphanage had faced financial problems in the months prior to the disappearance. Financial records revealed that St. Mary's Home was 3 months behind in supplier payments and had lost part of its state funding due to changes in child welfare policies. Mother Superior Margaret had written several letters to the local Catholic diocese requesting urgent financial assistance. But again, the evidence didn't support the theory. A mass escape of 27 people, including 6-year-old children, would require considerable financial resources, transportation, and planned destinations. Banking investigations revealed that none of the accounts associated with the orphanage had large withdrawals in the previous months. Additionally, Checks with relatives of the orphaned children revealed no contact or indication that they were planning to leave the institution. The third theory, and the most disturbing, was mass homicide, followed by concealment of corpses. This possibility gained credibility when the forensic team examined the concrete wall in the basement in more detail. Chemical analyses of the concrete confirmed that it had been applied recently, probably on the night of November 13th, or in the early hours of November 14th. The concrete contained chemical additives that accelerated drying time, suggesting that whoever had applied it wanted it to harden quickly. More alarming, preliminary tests detected traces of quicklime mixed in the concrete, a substance frequently used to accelerate the decomposition of organic material and eliminate odors. With judicial authorization, the FBI team began carefully breaking the concrete wall on November 18, 1979. The work was slow and meticulous, with each piece of concrete removed being carefully examined for evidence. Behind the wall, investigators found a small room, approximately 3 meters by 4 meters, that had been completely sealed. The room contained empty metal shelves, a rudimentary ventilation system that had been disconnected, and something that made the most experienced investigators fall silent: 27 small numbered metal plates, arranged in organized rows on the floor. Each plate had a number, from 1 to 27, deeply engraved in the metal. There were no names, no identifications, just numbers. The plates were organized by size, with the smallest, presumably from the youngest children, in front, and the largest, from the teenagers and adults, behind. But there were no bodies. There were no human remains. There was no physical evidence of the 27 missing people. The room was completely empty, except for the numbered plates and a strong smell of chemicals that forensic specialists couldn't immediately identify. More thorough tests of the room's soil revealed traces of unusual industrial chemical substances, compounds that were not typical of domestic cleaning products or construction materials. Some of the detected chemicals were used in high-heat industrial processes, suggesting that some type of incineration had occurred in the room. But incineration of what? And why were the numbered plates left behind? The impact of the discovery on the local community was devastating. Whitefish was a small town where everyone knew everyone, and many local residents had donated time, money, or resources to St. Mary's Home over the years. The idea that 23 innocent children and 4 dedicated staff members could have met such a terrible end was almost impossible to process. Vigils were organized. Prayer groups met daily. The local Catholic Church, already shaken by the loss of the orphanage, faced difficult questions about institutional oversight and responsibility. Emily Rodriguez and the other children became national symbols of child vulnerability and systemic failure. Their photos appeared in newspapers throughout the country, and the case generated debates about security in child care institutions. But no matter how much federal and local investigators worked, no matter how many resources were dedicated to the case, no matter how many theories were explored, one fundamental truth remained. 27 people had completely disappeared, leaving behind only numbered plates and unanswered questions. In March 1980, after 4 months of intensive investigation, the FBI was forced to reclassify the case as inactive, not closed, but without viable clues to continue the investigation. St. Mary's Home for Children was sealed as a crime scene and remained empty for the next 32 years, becoming a haunted reminder of a mystery that defied explanation. Until a discovery in 2012 changed everything. For 33 years, St. Mary's Home for Children remained as a silent monument to the impossible. The gray stone building, surrounded by faded police tape and federal property no entry signs, transformed into something between an urban legend and an unofficial sanctuary for one of the most inexplicable tragedies in American history. The decades that followed the disappearance brought successive waves of theories, renewed investigations, and speculations that ranged from plausible to completely fantastic. Each generation of investigators brought new technologies, new perspectives, and new hopes of finally solving the mystery of the 27 people who simply evaporated. In the 1980s, the predominant theory was that the case involved an extremist religious cult. The 80s were marked by national concerns about cults that targeted vulnerable children, and the orderly and simultaneous disappearance of an entire orphanage seemed to fit the pattern. Investigators specialized in cult activity revisited the case multiple times, looking for connections with known groups operating in the Pacific Northwest. They discovered that, in the months prior to the disappearance, several small cults had established communities in the remote mountains of Montana. One in particular, called Children of the New Earth, had shown specific interest in rescuing children from traditional government and religious institutions, but extensive investigations could not establish any direct connection between these cults and St. Mary's home. The 1990s brought the era of paranormal, investigators, and extraterrestrial abduction theories. The St. Mary's case became a favorite among UFO enthusiasts, who pointed to the impossible nature of the disappearance as evidence of extraterrestrial intervention. Television documentaries explored the theory that the 27 people had been taken for study or relocation to other planets. Although these theories were widely discredited by the scientific community, they kept the case in public consciousness. Books were written, independent films were produced, and St. Mary's home became a destination for pilgrimages by people convinced that extraterrestrial activity explained the mystery. In 1995, on the 16th anniversary of the disappearance, a group of private investigators obtained permission to conduct an independent investigation using ground-penetrating radar technology. They were looking for evidence of mass graves around the property, operating under the theory that the bodies had been buried somewhere near the orphanage. The radar investigation revealed several anomalies in the ground, areas where the earth had clearly been disturbed decades before. Careful excavations in these areas revealed buried objects, but not what investigators expected to find. Instead of human remains, they discovered personal items that clearly belonged to the missing children and staff. Emily Rodriguez's brown leather diary was found buried 1.5 meters below the surface, wrapped in plastic and perfectly preserved. The final pages detailed her normal life at the orphanage, without any indication of problems or imminent dangers. Favorite toys of the smaller children, prayer books of the staff, and even small personal jewelry were discovered in different locations around the property. But again, there were no bodies. It was as if someone had carefully buried the memories of the 27 missing people, creating a cemetery of memories without the dead themselves. The discovery of the personal items renewed public interest in the case and brought back some of the original families of the orphaned children. Distant relatives of Emily Rodriguez, who had lost contact with her when she was sent to the orphanage, appeared to claim her belongings. It was the first time in decades that the missing seemed real again, not just statistics or subjects of conspiracy theories, but real people with real lives that had been brutally interrupted. The 2000s brought advances in DNA analysis and forensic technology. Hair and fiber samples collected from the original scene were reanalyzed using methods that didn't exist in 1979. The results confirmed the presence of the 27 missing people at the orphanage, but provided no clues about what had happened to them. Even more frustrating, more sophisticated chemical analyses of the sealed room in the basement identified the detected chemical compounds as substances used in high-temperature industrial cremation. This suggested that some type of incineration had actually occurred in the room, but the technology necessary for complete cremation would require massive equipment that was never seen on the property. How could 27 people have been completely incinerated in a 12-square-meter room using equipment that was never brought to the site? During this period, the city of Whitefish grew around the abandoned orphanage. New residential developments were built nearby, and an entire generation of children grew up seeing the somber building as a normal part of their landscape. For them, St. Mary's home wasn't an active crime scene. It was just that haunted building where something terrible had happened long before they were born. But for the families of the missing, for the original investigators who were still alive, and for the community of people dedicated to solving the mystery, the case was never just history. Emily Rodriguez and the other 26 people remained present in their lives in an almost ghostly way. In 2009, 30 years after the disappearance, the city of Whitefish organized a public memorial for the 27 victims. A bronze plaque was installed on the orphanage grounds, listing all the names of the missing. The ceremony attracted hundreds of people, including retired investigators, surviving family members, and community members who had carried the weight of the mystery for 3 decades. It was during this ceremony that a crucial decision was made. The city, in cooperation with federal authorities, announced that St. Mary's Home for Children would finally be demolished. The building had deteriorated to the point of no longer being safe, and maintaining an active crime scene for more than 3 decades was no longer serving any useful investigative purpose. The demolition was scheduled for 2012 and would be conducted with complete archaeological supervision. Every piece of evidence would be carefully catalogued, every space would be thoroughly examined, and finally, the mystery of St. Mary's Home would be officially closed. Nobody expected that the demolition would reveal the most shocking truth of all. March 2012. 33 years after the disappearance, demolition machines finally arrived at St. Mary's Home for Children. What should have been a symbolic closure of one of the most frustrating cases in American history became, instead, the most surprising discovery in decades of investigation. The demolition team was led by Marcus Thompson, a local contractor specialized in removal of historic structures. He had grown up in Whitefish and knew the dark history of the orphanage, but was focused on the technical task of carefully dismantling an 89-year-old building without damaging neighboring structures. It was just another job for us, Marcus remembered. An old building that needed to be removed. Nobody expected to find this. The demolition began on the 3rd floor, working systematically downward. Each room was photographed and documented before removal. Each artifact was catalogued by archaeologists supervising the process. In the first 2 days, nothing unusual was discovered, just the remnants of an institution abandoned for decades. But on March 15, 2012, when the team reached the basement, everything changed. The sealed room that had been discovered in 1979 was reopened for the first time in more than 3 decades. The 27 numbered plates were still there, organized in their precise rows, now covered by a thin layer of dust. Archaeologists meticulously photographed each plate before removing them for later analysis. It was when they began removing the plates that the truly extraordinary discovery was made. Under plate number 15, which investigators later determined corresponded to Emily Rodriguez, there was something that shouldn't be there. A small metal lever embedded in the concrete floor. Dr. Sarah Harrison, forensic archaeologist supervising the excavation, carefully approached the lever. She had worked on hundreds of sites, from historic cemeteries to contemporary crime scenes, but had never seen anything like this. My first thought was that it could be part of the original plumbing system, she explained later. But when I examined it more closely, I realized that the lever was deliberately hidden under the roux plate. Someone had planned for it to be found only if the plates were removed. With extreme caution, Dr. Harrison activated the lever. What happened next made the entire demolition team step back in shock. An entire section of the sealed room's floor opened like a door, revealing a staircase that descended to a second underground room that appeared on no architectural blueprint of the orphanage. This second room was larger than the first, approximately 6 meters by 8 meters, and contained something that completely rewrote the narrative of the St. Mary's home case. The walls of the hidden room were covered from floor to ceiling with meticulously organized files. Hundreds of folders, documents, photographs, and detailed records that documented everything. In the center of the room was a metal table with 27 individual dossiers organized in numerical order. Each dossier corresponded to one of the missing people and contained information so detailed it was disturbing. Complete medical histories, psychological evaluations, photographs taken without the subject's knowledge, and behavioral records that extended for months before the disappearance. Emily Rodriguez's dossier, marked as Subject 15, contained more than 200 pages of documentation. There were transcripts of conversations she had had with other children, analyses of her diary entries, evaluations of her suitability for the project, and photographs of her performing normal, daily activities, clearly taken by hidden cameras. But most shocking were the medical records. Each of the 27 people had been subjected to extensive medical examinations in the months prior to the disappearance. Examinations that went far beyond the routine checkups documented in the orphanage's official records. Blood samples had been collected weekly, brain scans had been performed, and detailed genetic tests had been conducted. At the end of each dossier was a stamp. Approved for transfer. Project New Genesis. Investigators discovered records of an organization called Genesis Research Foundation that had apparently operated a secret facility in the underground levels of St. Mary's home for at least 1 year before the disappearance. The documents indicated that the orphanage had been chosen because it provided access to ideal test subjects, children without close families who could question their disappearance. Even more disturbing, the records suggested that Mother Superior Margaret and the other orphanage staff were not victims. They were active participants in the project. Documents showed substantial payments made to each staff member in exchange for their cooperation in facilitating the collection of research subjects. The secret room contained sophisticated medical equipment that had been removed before the 1979 investigation. Records of experimental procedures performed on the children without their knowledge, and most shocking of all, detailed maps of a network of underground facilities that extended for kilometers under the Montana mountains. Emily Rodriguez and the other children had not been killed or kidnapped in the traditional sense. They had been transferred to what the documents called Advanced Research Facility as part of a human experimentation project that had been planned for months. The discovery of the secret room in 2012 finally explained the impossible. How 27 appear without leaving traces. They had not left the orphanage through the surface. They had been taken through underground tunnels to a facility that officially never existed. But this revelation only raised even more disturbing questions. What was Project New Genesis? Who was behind the Genesis Research Foundation? And most importantly, were Emily Rodriguez and the other people still alive somewhere in the tunnels under Montana? The truth, when it finally emerged from the files in the secret room, was more terrible than any conspiracy theory could ever imagine. The documents found in the secret room revealed a truth that shook not only the St. Mary's home investigation, but public confidence in institutions that should protect the most vulnerable. Project New Genesis was a clandestine medical research operation financed by a combination of unofficial military funds and private pharmaceutical corporations during the late 1970s. The stated objective was to develop advanced psychological conditioning and behavioral modification techniques using isolated and controlled subjects. Emily Rodriguez and the other 26 people were not killed. They were transferred to an underground facility located 15 kilometers east of the orphanage, where they became involuntary subjects in experiments that violated every known ethical principle of medical research. The records indicated that the children were subjected to experimental drug testing, brainwashing techniques, and procedures aimed at reprogramming their personalities and memories. The project operated for approximately 2 years after the disappearance, with funding being cut in 1981 when political changes in Washington made such operations too risky to continue. The documentation suggested that, when the project was terminated, evidence was systematically destroyed, and the research subjects were relocated to long-term facilities, a euphemism that modern investigators interpreted as elimination. The Genesis Research Foundation was officially dissolved in 1982, its records were classified under national secrecy, and all those involved signed confidentiality agreements that remained in effect for decades. The discovery of the secret room forced a renewed federal investigation that involved multiple government agencies. Several of the facilities mentioned in the documents were located and excavated, revealing evidence of destroyed medical equipment and chambers that had clearly been used for human confinement. But Emily Rodriguez and the other victims were never found. The final project records simply stated that all subjects had been successfully processed, clinical language that concealed terrible fates. Today, an ongoing investigation continues, with federal authorities still searching for any physical evidence of the 27 victims. The case has been reclassified as crimes against humanity, and several people identified in the documents face federal charges. A permanent memorial has been established at the site of the former St. Mary's home, listing the names of Emily Rodriguez and all the other victims. They are remembered not as experimental subjects, but as the children and adults they were, people with dreams, hopes, and rights that were brutally violated. The St. Mary's home case serves as a dark reminder that the greatest monsters often hide behind respectable institutions, and that the truth, no matter how terrible, deserves to be revealed. Emily Rodriguez finally found peace, not through answers, but through the remembrance of who she really was, a brave young woman who cared for others until the end.